What conversation with a stranger left you thinking if you just talked to something not human? Story 1. One day, it was raining, and my husband and I decided to stop at a car wash to vacuum the inside of my car. On the way there, he mentioned how much he was craving ice cream, so we made plans to stop at Dairy Queen afterward. While we were at the car wash, a man approached us and handed us a full bottle of glass cleaner, even though we hadn't asked for it. Another man gave my husband a thumbs up while I was vacuuming, so he returned the gesture. The man then walked up to my husband, gave him $20, and told him to treat himself to some ice cream. We had never met this man, and the only interaction we'd had was the thumbs up from a distance. We still remember this day, and it's something we'll never forget. Story 2. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I worked as a security guard at a blood testing center. My job was to keep track of how many people entered and left the building. One evening, with only a few minutes before closing, a small, elderly man with a long white beard came up to me and began talking about Jesus. He shared his thoughts for almost 2 hours and even got emotional while speaking. As it was getting close to closing time, he said I should keep my faith strong. When the time came, he said he was going to head inside, but when I looked up, it had been over 10 minutes and he hadn't returned. The staff turned off the lights, locked up, and left, but the man was nowhere to be found. We have no idea what happened to him. Story 3. After my mom passed away, I moved to a large city to escape old memories. I was trying to start fresh after a bad breakup with an abusive ex. One day, my ex invited me over to talk about how I was coping with my mom's death. However, we ended up in a huge argument. He was manipulative and emotionally abusive, and it turned violent. I tried to defend myself, hitting him with one of his consoles, and when the police arrived, they arrested me. Despite him having assault charges against him, I was the one taken to jail because the bruises on my face hadn't shown up yet. I spent almost 2 days in a holding cell, surrounded by women in worse situations than mine. Eventually, a friend posted my bail and I was released. I had no money, phone, or jacket. It was early morning, and I had to walk about 20 miles to get back home. Along the way, a homeless man gave me his worn leather jacket to keep me warm, and I was incredibly grateful. Story 4. At the restaurant I worked at, there was an elderly woman who came in every Sunday at 11 a.m. She ordered the same meal every time and sat by herself, mostly keeping to herself but always tipping the same amount. One weekend, I was assigned to her table, and that day she was unusually talkative. She kept asking about my grandparents, telling me to thank them and tell them I loved them. Toward the end of the meal, she was fixated on my necklace, a gold chain with a crucifix that my grandmother had given me when I was 14. She grabbed the necklace, pulled it towards her, and said that as long as I wore it, my grandmother would be watching over me. I didn't think much of it, assuming she was just lonely. After work, I went to a gas station, and when I paid for my items, the total came to $13.55. This was the same amount she always tipped. Felt like more than a coincidence. Story 5. One day, I was working at a store and helped a customer who was fairly average. Nothing stood out about him, except for his strikingly blue eyes. He shook my hand after his transaction, and as soon as I did, I felt an overwhelming sense of nausea and dread, as though something was deeply wrong. The way he smiled as he held my hand made me feel like he knew exactly what I was feeling, and I was convinced he enjoyed it. I've never felt anything like that before. After he left, I went to the back and sat down, still sick to my stomach. It was the most unsettling encounter I've ever had, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in danger. Story 6. A couple of years ago, I attended a concert with my partner. We were sitting near the center when a couple took the seats next to us. After a few minutes, I started feeling something odd coming from their direction. I glanced at them and immediately noticed something wasn't right. They both seemed unnaturally large, as if their bodies had been inflated. Their hands, limbs, everything seemed too big. They didn't smell like humans either. It was hard to describe, but it felt like a strange electrical sensation in the air. My partner noticed the same thing, and we both grew uncomfortable. He suggested we leave, but before we could do anything, it was intermission, and they got up and left. Once they were gone, the strange sensation vanished, and we felt better. To this day, we can't explain what happened, but it was definitely one of the strangest experiences we've ever had. Story 7. When I was in college, I was waiting for an event to start, people watching as I stood in a crowded venue. I noticed a man walking around, but what was odd was that no one was paying attention to him, yet they made way for him as if something compelled them to do so. Then, out of nowhere, he looked at me and walked over. We had a brief conversation, but I don't really remember what we talked about. However, I remember him telling me, "Don't do that," when I was focusing hard on trying to remember what he looked like. At some point, I had a vague sense that we were somewhere else, though I don't remember how we got there. Then, out of nowhere, I was just back in the crowd. Later, I noticed a small scratch on my arm that I couldn't remember getting. It wasn't painful, but it felt odd, like an incision. I've always wondered if that man was more than just a regular person, maybe something supernatural. Story 8. I once had a strange experience with a coworker at Walmart. My friend and I had a telepathic connection, which we discovered a year before we started working there. One day, I was standing in line, not saying anything but thinking about how much I disliked a certain person in the store. To my shock, my friend, who wasn't looking at me, stopped mid-conversation with someone else and said exactly what I was thinking, down to the words. She said, "Beady little eyes," which was exactly what I had thought about the person. We were both astonished and freaked out. Even our coworker commented that it was freaking him out. We had other similar experiences, but nothing ever as intense as that moment. Story 9. Years ago, my friends and I were on a road trip from Los Angeles to Las Vegas. We stopped at a fast food restaurant to grab a bite, and while we were there, we noticed two men who looked completely out of place. They were middle-aged with very pale skin, almost albino, and wore thick sweaters despite the scorching 100-degree heat. They spoke in a foreign language none of us could recognize. What really caught our attention, however, was how they ate. They had no clue how to eat a hamburger. One man held the burger up vertically and bit into the bottom bun first. It was one of the oddest things we'd ever seen, and we couldn't help but feel like we had just witnessed an alien encounter. Story 10. On a long drive back home, I witnessed a tragic car accident just moments before it happened. A small child was ejected from a car and tragically passed away right in front of me. I was stuck at the scene for about 4 hours, feeling completely shaken by the experience. As I sat in my car, crying, a man suddenly appeared at my window. He asked if I was okay, having seen me upset. He told me he was a veteran, and we ended up talking for a long time. He shared stories about his service, and his words were incredibly comforting, inspiring me to follow through with a project I had been putting off. When the accident was cleared, we said goodbye, and I noticed that the man seemed to vanish as quickly as he had appeared. To this day, I believe he was sent to help me and comfort me during that difficult moment. Story 11. I was on base for my first drill weekend with the Air Force Reserve. After a long and stressful medical history that delayed my acceptance, it was finally my time to report to my unit. As I was walking out of the hotel at 5:30 a.m., a military police officer was walking in. He looked like someone I'd never met before, but when I smiled at him, he responded with, "Have a great day." I thanked him, and as I walked away, he suddenly added, "You know you're doing great. I'm proud of you, honey. You're going to have an amazing day. I love you." I was shocked and a bit teary-eyed because it felt just like something my dad used to say to me before he passed away. It felt like a message from him through the officer. I wonder if the man even realized the depth of what he said, but I've never forgotten it. I wish I had gone back to thank him. Story 12. My wife and I had been trying to have a baby for years, but nothing seemed to work. I travel a lot for work, and one day I was in Dallas, Texas, grabbing gas and food when I noticed a young woman sitting in her car, crying. I asked her what was wrong, and she told me that her mom had passed away, and she was trying to get to North Carolina to take care of her dad. But her car broke down, and she had no money to fix it. I felt compelled to help her. After getting the kids' McDonald's order, I jokingly asked if there were any mechanics around. A couple of guys followed me to her car, and we found out the problem was a fuel sensor. They fixed it for her, no charge, and she was soon on her way. As she left, her youngest daughter, who hadn't said a word during the whole exchange, walked up to me, took my hand and said, "You'll make a good dad." The moment she said that, I felt something profound. Weeks later, while on another trip, my wife called, and we were overjoyed to learn that she was pregnant. Our sons are now 7 and 8 years old. It feels like that moment was not a coincidence at all. Story 13. I was in a psychiatric ward for the first time, and there was a woman there named June who claimed to talk to God and was married to Satan. She told everyone that October 14th at 9:41 p.m. would be the day the apocalypse would happen. I didn't fully believe her, but I couldn't help but feel a strange surge of energy when she spoke about it. That day, there was a heavy, negative energy in the air. 2 fights broke out between patients and staff. By the time evening came, we were all waiting for the end of the world. At exactly 9:41 p.m., my friend had a seizure. June tried to get into the room while it was happening, but the doors were locked. Afterward, June claimed that a demon tried to possess my friend but that she had successfully exorcised it, causing God to postpone the apocalypse. The next day, everything was calm, and the bad energy was gone. I still don't know if it was all a coincidence, but it was certainly an intense and bizarre experience. Story 14. When I was younger, my family went on a day trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. My dad, a Civil War enthusiast, was excited to visit a place called Devil's Denver. As we were walking up a rocky hill, a man in a full Union uniform approached us. I thought he was a tour guide since they used to wear uniforms like that. He spoke to my parents, mainly to my dad, and pointed out various locations. I grew bored and walked to the edge of the hill to look down but saw nothing. When I turned around to tell the man, he had disappeared. We walked down the hill searching for him, but there was no sign of him anywhere. Later, my dad told me that the man had known his first name and mentioned towns that were destroyed during the Civil War. It turns out, the park didn't have tour guides wearing uniforms that day, and my dad even noticed the man wasn't sweating despite the heat. It was an eerie experience, and I still wonder who that man really was. Story 15. I lived in an old house in the hills of western Maryland, and there were strange things that often happened there. The house was unique in that it only had windows in the front and back, as it was built to prevent slaves from looking inside. My family rented the house from a friend, and we were warned that it was special, but no one explained what that meant. A few months before I moved out, I noticed something odd one evening. Across the street, there was a ridge with a steady white light on top, always on at night. One evening, I noticed that the light was off, and as I walked down the driveway to investigate, I was suddenly stopped by a man who warned me not to go any further. He said, "Your eyes aren't meant to see," and I felt an odd, ominous tone in his voice. I looked up and saw that the light was now pulsing, which only made the situation feel even stranger. The man vanished in a matter of seconds, and when I returned inside, I tried to make sense of it. Later, when I checked the area on Google Maps, there was nothing beyond the ridge, just empty land. To this day, I have no idea what happened that night. Story 16. I grew up in a small town, and one day, my mom was picking me up from school when our car suddenly got a flat tire. We drove to the nearest gas station, and I went inside to get a can of Fix-A-Flat. As I was the only one in the store, I suddenly heard a voice say, "Got a flat tire?" I looked up and saw a mechanic standing in front of me, even though there was no way he could have come in without me noticing. He told me to have my mom pull around to the air pump, and he would meet us there with his truck. I didn't even mention my mom, but he somehow knew. When we got there, he patched the tire, filled it with air, and refused any payment from my mom. He got back in his truck and drove off. As we followed him down the road, we came around a curve and found that he had vanished. There were no other roads or places he could have gone. We even checked later and found the company name on his truck didn't exist. It's one of the strangest things that has ever happened to us. Story 17. Years ago, I worked at a Ben and Jerry's ice cream shop, and it was a slow shift during the morning hours. I had recently hurt my knee, and the pain had been bothering me for days. One afternoon, a group of 4 people walked into the shop, 2 men and 2 women. I didn't think much of it until one of the women, who spoke with a strong accent, noticed my limp. She asked if she could hold my hand and say a prayer for me. Although it was unusual, I agreed. She held my hand and began praying, and in that moment, the pain in my knee completely lifted. I couldn't believe it, and I've never had any pain in my knee since that day. I never saw her again, but I'll always remember how she helped me that day. Story 18. Last year, I moved into a new apartment complex, and I began to suspect that my neighbors were not quite normal. They were a middle-aged couple, and while the husband was always overly nice in a way that seemed insincere, it was the wife who was truly bizarre. Whenever I saw her, she would stare at me silently, never speaking. One strange habit she had was that she never wore shoes, even in the pouring rain. She would do everything in socks, whether it was playing with her kids outside or just standing by the apartment entrance watching people. One evening, I noticed her staring at me as I pulled into my parking space. I thought it was odd, but it wasn't until I began to pay more attention that I realized how consistently strange their behavior was. It was as though they were trying to put on a facade of normalcy, but everything they did seemed off, like something out of a Men in Black movie. Story 19. One evening, I was in a Kroger parking lot when a woman approached me, saying, "I miss my mother." I turned around, confused, to find a woman standing there who seemed odd. She was a strange mix of young and old, with a mismatched yellow sweater and bangs in her hair. She told me her mother had passed away, and after we talked for a moment, she asked if I could spare some money. I gave her a couple of dollars, and as I was putting my things in the car, I turned to look back at her. She was gone. There wasn't enough time for her to disappear that quickly, and I couldn't find her anywhere in the parking lot. It was like she vanished into thin air. Story 20. In my town, there's a man who has become somewhat of a local legend. He's tall, lanky, with tan skin and dark glasses, and he's been seen wandering around for years. His clothes are always worn out, and his age is impossible to guess. People often take pictures of him because he seems so unusual, but no one knows his name or where he lives. He's a bit of an enigma. He's been spotted walking around town for as long as I can remember, but I've never been able to get close enough to talk to him. His presence is so odd that it makes me wonder if he's even human. Some of the townspeople believe he's not, and it's hard to shake the feeling that there's something more to him than just a quirky man. Story 21. A few years ago, my dad shared a story with me that I'll never forget. He had been going to a small convenience store in town when he encountered a new cashier. As he was leaving, the cashier asked him, "No trail mix today?" It was strange because my dad had never liked trail mix. Later, the same cashier asked him the same question again, and again my dad hadn't bought any. After that, my dad didn't see the cashier again. A few months later, my dad started buying trail mix regularly to take to work, but one day he decided not to. The same cashier asked, "No trail mix today?" And my dad remembered the strange encounter. To this day, my dad still finds it creepy, and he shares the story with friends. Story 22. When I was walking through a cemetery one day, I ran into a man I knew, though I wasn't sure what he was doing there. He was about 100 feet away from his family's burial plot, and something about him seemed off. He looked older than usual and appeared down, which was unusual for him. He wore an old suit, one that was out of fashion, and as I spoke to him, I noticed he seemed a bit distant. The next day, I learned he had passed away from a heart attack the night before. The strange thing is, I had met him during the time he passed away. Later, I found out this was called a crisis apparition. I still think about it and wonder if it was a ghost or something else, but it's one of the most surreal experiences I've had. Story 23. I grew up in houses that were said to be haunted, but none of the experiences were ever truly frightening, just unusual. One house, in particular, had its quirks. Things would disappear or move around without explanation. One evening, I was in the house when a man appeared out of nowhere and told me not to go near the ridge across the street. He was very odd, warning me that my eyes weren't meant to see. I didn't think much of it at the time, but later that night, I noticed strange lights coming from the ridge. When I tried to talk to the man again, he disappeared in the blink of an eye. I never understood what happened that night, but it left me feeling uneasy. The ridge remained a mystery, and even when I searched on Google Maps, I found there was nothing beyond it. Story 24. When I was a teenager, my family went on a trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to visit a Civil War site called Devil's Denver. My dad, being a history buff, was excited to show us the location. As we walked up a rocky hill, we were approached by a man wearing a full Union soldier uniform, which seemed odd because it was so hot outside. I figured he was a tour guide, though we never spoke to him directly. He was very focused on my dad and pointed out various towns and places from the Civil War. Later, when we reached the top of the hill, I noticed that the man had disappeared without a trace. We looked everywhere, but there was no sign of him. My dad later realized that the man had known his first name, and some of the towns he pointed out were ones that were destroyed during the war. The strange thing was that no tour guides wore uniforms that day, and my dad even remembered that the man hadn't been sweating despite the heat. It was a strange encounter that we've never been able to explain. Story 25. I had a strange experience when I was walking in the hills of Western Maryland. The house I lived in had only windows at the front and back, but there was a small ridge across the street with a light that was always on at night. One evening, I noticed the light was off, so I went out to investigate. As I walked down the driveway, a man suddenly appeared and told me not to go any further, warning that my eyes weren't meant to see. I looked up at the ridge, and the light started pulsing. When I turned back, the man had disappeared in an instant. I walked back to my house, confused, but later I checked the area on a map and found that there was nothing beyond the ridge. No roads, no buildings, just empty land. To this day, I can't explain what happened or who that man was, but I felt like I was warned about something I shouldn't have seen. Story 26. A few years ago, my family and I were on a day trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and my dad, a Civil War enthusiast, was eager to visit a spot called Devil's Den, where many soldiers had been killed during one of the war's bloodiest battles. We were walking up a rocky hill when we were approached by a man in a full Union soldier uniform. At first, I thought he was just a tour guide, as they often dressed like that. He spoke mostly to my dad, pointing out various towns and areas from the war. After a while, I grew bored and walked to the edge of the hill to look down. But when I turned around to ask the man about something, he had vanished. We searched for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Later, my dad told me that the man had known his first name, and some of the towns he pointed out had been destroyed during the Civil War. It turned out that the park didn't have any tour guides wearing uniforms that day, and my dad remembered that the man hadn't even been sweating despite the heat. It's a memory that's always stuck with me. Story 27. I used to live in an old house in Western Maryland, and there were often strange occurrences. One night, I noticed that a steady white light on top of a ridge across the street was off. Curious, I decided to investigate. As I walked down the driveway, a man appeared and warned me not to go any further, saying my eyes weren't meant to see. I was confused, but when I looked back at the light, it started to pulse. The man was gone in an instant, and when I checked the area on a map later, I found there was nothing beyond the ridge. No roads, no buildings. Just empty land. It's one of the strangest experiences I've had, and I can't explain it. Story 28. Years ago, I had an unusual encounter at a convenience store. My dad was a regular at the store, and one day, he encountered a new cashier who asked him, "No trail mix today?" It struck my dad as odd since he never really liked trail mix. Later, the same cashier asked him the same question again. A few months later, my dad started buying trail mix for work, and sure enough, the cashier asked him again, "No trail mix today?" This time, it clicked for my dad, and he realized he'd had a strange encounter with this cashier. The mystery continued when the cashier disappeared from the store after that. My dad still talks about it, and it always sends a chill down his spine. Story 29. I was on a late-night walk through an old park near my house when I noticed an abandoned swing set. The swings creaked eerily in the wind, though there was no breeze. As I got closer, I saw a woman sitting on one of the swings, her head bent down, her long hair covering her face. I approached slowly, thinking she might be in distress, but when I got within a few feet, she suddenly stood up and turned toward me. Her face was completely blank. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, pale skin. I froze, and she took a step toward me, but then, in an instant, vanished into thin air. I stood there for a few minutes, too scared to move, before running home. I've never seen her again, but the memory of her hollow face still haunts me. Story 30. During a summer trip to a remote cabin in the woods, I woke up one night to the sound of someone crying outside my window. At first, I thought it was an animal or someone in distress, so I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. The crying grew louder, but the forest was eerily quiet. I followed the sound until I stumbled upon a small clearing. There, sitting on the ground, was a woman in a tattered white dress, rocking back and forth, sobbing. When I called out to her, she stopped, looked up at me with empty, hollow eyes and whispered, "I need to go home." Then, without moving, she vanished into the darkness. I ran back to the cabin, locking the door behind me, too afraid to go back out until the morning. Story 31. One evening, I was walking home from work when I saw a man standing on the corner of the street. His head was tilted unnaturally to the side, and his eyes glowed faintly in the dim streetlight. I tried to ignore him, but as I passed, he spoke in a voice that was too low to be human. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. I froze, my blood running cold, and when I looked back, he was still staring at me, though he hadn't moved an inch. As I hurried away, I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned around, there was no one there. When I finally reached my door, I glanced back, and the man was standing on the same corner, watching me. To this day, I still avoid that street. Story 32. I was staying in a hotel near a small town for work and decided to take a late-night walk to clear my head. The town seemed abandoned, with no lights on, but as I passed a small alley, I saw a flicker of light. Curious, I followed the glow to find a small, run-down house at the end of the alley. I knocked, and the door creaked open, revealing an old woman with wild eyes. She stared at me for a moment before whispering, "You shouldn't have come." I felt a chill run down my spine, but before I could leave, she stepped aside and gestured for me to enter. The house was filled with old portraits, each one of a different person, but they all had one thing in common: empty eyes. I ran out of there faster than I've ever run in my life. Story 33. While on a road trip through a quiet, rural area, I decided to stop at a small gas station for a break. The place was run down, with flickering lights and an air of neglect. As I walked to the counter, I noticed an elderly man sitting by the window, staring out into the dark. His eyes were unnaturally still, and he didn't seem to blink. I tried to make small talk with the cashier, but every now and then, the man would turn and look directly at me, his gaze piercing. Eventually, I paid and left, but as I stepped outside, I noticed he was standing right behind me, his cold breath on my neck. When I spun around to confront him, he was gone. The air around me felt heavy, like something had followed me, but I never saw him again. Story 34. I once stayed in a small, isolated bed and breakfast while traveling for work. It was located at the edge of a forest, far from any other houses or buildings. The first night, I went to sleep feeling uneasy, but when I woke up, I noticed that the curtains were drawn wide open, even though I had closed them before bed. I thought I must have forgotten, but then I saw something disturbing. Footprints in the dust on the floor, leading from the window to my bed. I hadn't heard anyone enter the room. Terrified, I looked out the window, but there was nothing but the dark forest. The next morning, I confronted the innkeeper, who simply smiled and said, "Some guests like to explore the forest at night." I checked out immediately, never staying there again. Story 35. During a hiking trip in the mountains, I decided to explore a small cave I had noticed from a distance. The inside was tight and narrow, but after squeezing through, I found an expansive underground chamber. The air was stale, and the only light came from the flashlight on my phone. As I walked deeper into the cave, I started hearing whispers echoing around me. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the voices grew clearer, murmuring my name. Panic set in, and I turned to leave, only to find the tunnel I had entered through was completely blocked off. I tried another passage, but it only led to more dead ends. When I finally stumbled back to the entrance, I saw shadows flicker at the edges of the cave, moving as if something was watching me. I didn't wait to find out what it was. Story 36. A few years ago, I was living in a rented apartment in a quiet part of town. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my window. Confused, I pulled back the curtains but saw nothing. Thinking it was a prank, I went back to sleep. The next night, the same thing happened, knocking, but no one there when I checked. Over the course of the next week, it happened every night, always at the same time. One evening, I decided to stay awake and catch whoever was responsible. As the clock struck midnight, I heard the knock again. I rushed to the window, but this time, I saw a figure standing across the street, just staring at me. The moment I looked at it, it vanished, leaving only the sound of wind rattling the trees. I moved out of that apartment the very next day. Story 37. I was in a small town for a job interview and decided to visit a local diner afterward. It was a quiet, old-fashioned place with checkered floors and vintage signs. As I sat down, the waitress handed me a menu, but something seemed off. She kept looking at me strangely, as if she knew me. When I asked her what the specials were, she simply said, "The usual." I thought it was odd but didn't think much of it. Later, after finishing my meal, I left the diner and walked back to my car. As I passed the window, I glanced inside and saw that the waitress was still staring at me. It hit me then. I hadn't seen anyone else in the diner. The place was empty, and I was the only customer. I quickly drove away and never looked back. Story 38. I was at a small grocery store late one night, and there was only one other person in the store, a man standing in the far corner by the canned goods. He was oddly still, not moving at all. I went about my shopping, but every time I glanced back toward him, I noticed he was just staring at me. His eyes never blinked, never moved. I could feel his gaze on me, and it made my skin crawl. I quickly checked out and headed for the exit, but as I stepped outside, I saw him standing on the other side of the door, waiting for me. I froze, but when I looked again, he was gone. I didn't go back to that store for weeks. It still gives me chills thinking about the way he just watched me, motionless, like he wasn't quite human. Story 39. I was in a small grocery store late one night when I noticed a man standing at the far end of the aisle, not moving, just staring at me. His gaze was so intense, it made my skin crawl. I tried to ignore him, thinking he was just another late-night shopper, but every time I looked back, he was still standing there, eyes fixed on me. The strange part was he never blinked. His eyes were unnaturally still, and his posture didn't shift at all. I grabbed my things quickly and headed to the checkout, but as I passed the door to leave, I looked back. To my horror, he was standing right outside, waiting for me. I turned around again, and in the time it took me to blink, he was gone. I've never seen him again, but I can't shake the feeling he was something off. Story 40. While hiking through a remote part of the woods, I came across an old shack that looked abandoned. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to go inside. As I stepped through the doorway, I noticed a man sitting by the window, staring out. His clothes were old-fashioned, and his face was gaunt, as if he hadn't seen sunlight in years. He didn't acknowledge my presence, so I hesitated, unsure if I should speak to him. Finally, I asked if he needed help. Without turning, he replied, "I'm waiting for you." The words felt wrong, too deliberate. I took a step back, but when I looked around, the shack seemed to be closing in on me. I ran outside, but when I glanced back, the shack was empty. I never found out who he was, or what he meant by waiting for me. Story 41. I was staying at a hotel in a quiet town, and one evening, I decided to grab a drink at the bar. The place was nearly empty, save for an older man sitting at the counter. He looked normal at first, just a regular guest passing time, but when he started talking to me, it felt strange. He spoke as if he knew my entire life, the friends I had lost, the dreams I had abandoned. I tried to brush it off, but it was too detailed, too specific. At one point, he leaned in close and said, "You think you're running from it, but you're not. It follows you." His voice was low and calm, like he was delivering a warning. I quickly excused myself and left the bar. I've never been able to shake that conversation, and sometimes I wonder if that man was something more than just a strange traveler. Story 42. While walking home one evening, I noticed an elderly woman sitting alone on a park bench. I sat down nearby, and she struck up a conversation. At first, it seemed innocent, but as she spoke, her words became unsettlingly precise. She described details about my childhood, where I grew up, my favorite places, even the pets I had long forgotten. The way she spoke made it feel as though she was reading from a script, almost as if she knew my every thought. She then said, "You're nearing the end of one path and the beginning of another. Don't be afraid to take the step." I felt a chill run down my spine as she smiled and slowly stood up. When I looked back, she was gone. It felt like a moment with someone or something far beyond ordinary human knowledge. Story 43. I was on a road trip through a small, isolated town when I stopped for gas at a rundown station. As I filled my car, a man approached me and struck up a conversation about the weather, but quickly he started talking about things that I hadn't shared with him. My job, my personal life, even the troubles I had been dealing with in my relationship. He spoke with such calm assurance, like he knew everything. I asked him how he knew all this, and he simply replied, "I've been watching you. I'm here to guide you." Before I could respond, he walked away and disappeared into the night. I stood there, frozen, wondering if I had just spoken to someone who wasn't entirely human. The encounter left me unsettled for the rest of my trip. Story 44. I was walking through an old part of town when I noticed a man standing by an ancient oak tree, staring at the ground. His posture was stiff, and his clothes were worn and outdated, like something from another era. I almost didn't approach, but I was drawn to him, curious. As I got closer, he turned and spoke to me in a calm, measured voice. "You'll soon find yourself at a crossroads. You can't avoid it, no matter how hard you try." He spoke as if he knew exactly what was happening in my life. I asked him what he meant, but before he could answer, he turned and walked away, his figure blending into the shadows of the trees. I stood there for a moment, unsure whether he was a man, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely. Story 45. Late one night, I was in a small convenience store in a sleepy town when I noticed a woman standing at the end of the aisle. She was holding a jar of jam, but she wasn't moving, just staring at it. I thought it was odd, so I walked closer to ask if she needed help. As I approached, she looked up at me and smiled, a smile that was both welcoming and unsettling. "You'll be fine," she said softly. "Everything you've lost will be returned to you, but it comes at a price." I was about to ask what she meant when she turned and walked out of the store, leaving the jar of jam behind. I stood there, staring at it, unsure if I had just had a conversation with a stranger or something much older and wiser than I could comprehend. Story 46. I was at a bus stop one evening when a man sat down beside me. His face was weathered, but there was something in his eyes that felt ancient, like he had seen things no one should have seen. He started talking to me about my life, where I was going, the struggles I had been facing, and even my future. He told me I was on the right path but warned, "You'll soon encounter a shadow of yourself. Don't look back." His words sent a cold shiver down my spine. I laughed nervously, unsure if I was just hearing things. But when I turned to respond, he was gone. I looked around and couldn't find him anywhere. I've never been able to shake the feeling that I was spoken to by something other than a man. Story 47. I was visiting a small antique shop when I noticed a woman standing at the counter. She was dressed in black, her eyes locked on me in an unnerving way. She didn't say a word, but as I reached for a trinket, she whispered, "You're about to discover a truth you weren't ready for." Startled, I turned to her, but she was still staring at me with an intensity that was impossible to look away from. "You've been searching for answers, haven't you?" she continued. "The answers are closer than you think." I couldn't move, feeling a sense of dread as she spoke. As I looked away for a moment, I turned back to find she had vanished. I rushed out of the shop, my mind racing, unsure if that woman was even human or something that had been watching me for far longer than I realized. Story 48. I was staying in a remote cabin for the weekend when a man knocked on my door late one night. His face was pale, his eyes empty, but his voice was calm as he asked if he could borrow a flashlight. I hesitated but handed him one, and he thanked me before disappearing into the darkness. Hours later, I heard a tapping on my window. I looked outside but saw nothing. Then, I saw him again, standing just beyond the tree line, staring directly at me. He didn't move. I closed the curtains, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I checked the area outside, but there were no footprints in the snow. I've never been able to explain who he was or what his intent might have been, but something told me I wasn't the first person he'd visited.